Dear students, dear guests, welcome to the fourth lecture of our joint seminar, Global Governance and the Role of Cities. This course is a partnership between the Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen in Germany and the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. In this course, we will address various perspectives on the topic, such as challenges faced by big cities, sustainable cities, migration, and health issues. We will have guests from different countries and contexts to contribute with lectures, which will be interspersed with more practical classes in which students will do case studies on Latin American, African, and Asian big cities. In both universities, the course is offered to students of different disciplines, in Tübingen as part of the Transdisciplinary Course Program, and at the Federal University of ABC as a free extension course. The course organizers are Professor Gilberto Rodrigues, Federal University of ABC, and me, Dr. Glaucia Peres da Silva, University of Tübingen. Today, we will hear a lecture on sustainable cities from the perspective of African cities with Professor Edgar Pieterse from African Center of Cities in South Africa. He's an urban scholar, writer, and creative agent whose interests include the theory and practice of imaginaries to make the southern city more just, open, and experimental. Professor Pieterse is founding director of the African Center for Cities and professor in the School of Architecture and Planning, both at the University of Cape Town, and holder of the DST-NRF South African Research Chair in Urban Policy. His research and teaching gravitates around urban development politics, everyday culture, publics, radical social economies, responsive design, and adaptive governance systems. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Pieterse. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Good evening and afternoon to everyone, wherever you may be dialing in. In Cape Town, it's definitely evening and I am missing my dinner. So if I go rather gray during the talk, you understand why. More seriously, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I really want to congratulate the two partnering universities for this initiative, because obviously, just given the scale and the complexity of the urbanization challenges across the world, both in the North and the South, we can't have enough urban practitioners with a critical perspective to engage with these issues. So I'm delighted to form a part of the series of talks that you're going through, and the topic that I was asked to speak to was around sustainable infrastructure or sustainable cities through the lens of infrastructure, which is the bias that I come with. So I'll share slides, and that's just to help and order the discussion. But we'll have ample time after the lecture for you to engage and ask questions and critique what I'm saying. So what I want to focus on this evening is to start us off with pausing a little bit and trying to explore what do we understand collectively, and both in sort of popular terms, if you will, in political policy terms, but also in scholarly terms, with this idea of sustainable development. And I want to very briefly walk you through what has now been a 30+ year journey since the Brundtland Report was published in 1987. And there's been fierce contestation about what we mean with sustainable development. I then want to take the sort of working definition that we end up with, which I argue is evident in the way the 17 Sustainable Development Goals have been formulated, and then turn to the African context as a grounding, and then ask the question, this idea of sustainable cities, what might it mean? How do we advance that agenda in the context of what I will term informal urbanization, which is the dominant mode of urbanization in most of sub-Saharan Africa? And then touch on briefly on what some of the governance implications might be, and end off with two examples of instructive practices, examples that is part of the focus of current research at the moment, where we are trying to map out sort of instances of experimentation and innovation with regard to sustainable urban development in the African context. It will be very brief, but all of this, because each of these, of course, are quite large topics. So let's start off with some of the definitional questions. So if we go back to our common future, this global report under the chairpersonship of Brundtland that was published in 1987, we end up with this very well-known definition of sustainability, where it refers to the imperative of achieving balance between economic, social, and environmental factors, and to consider both present and future generations, and to think of sustainability in those temporal terms as well. And this idea was really consolidated in Brazil with the Rio Summit in 1991. And this global policy edifice was built around the pursuit of sustainable development. And of course, what followed the rest of the 1990s was a series of sectoral global conferences under the auspices of the United Nations, dealing with a variety of topics from social development to questions about reproductive health, and various other summits that were convened throughout the 90s. But throughout that, up until the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, this understanding of sustainability was absolutely ubiquitous. Now, when we look at some of the global networks that deal specifically with the advancement of sustainability at the urban scale, such as ICLE, which is probably one of the largest and most influential networks that have really sprung to prominence after the Rio Summit in 91, they argue that sustainable cities work towards an environmentally, socially, and economically healthy and resilient habitat for existing populations without compromising the ability of future generations to experience the same. And so you can very clearly see the continuity with the idea of this Venn diagram, the 3 dimensions of sustainability and the intergenerational aspect to that. Now, if we sort of then turn to this Venn diagram representation, this of course is everywhere. And, especially if we look at how this agenda of sustainable development has been picked up by the corporate sector in the last 10, 15 years, in particular, as expressed in their requirements now to report on environmental, social, and economic impact. It is just clear that as a discourse, it has been incredibly powerful and pervasive. But there's always been a critique of this, and one of the readings that I offered for this evening traces some of that critique, and I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but it's a piece that I published in 2011, and it kind of, through the work of particularly the Argentinian urbanist Adriana Allen, goes into some of that critique. What I want to focus on, though, is what I would argue is a profound ontological shift that has happened in the last 10, 15 years, where critique and criticism from, if you will, deep ecologists have really displaced, or at least started to compete with this particular understanding of balance that comes from the Brundtland definition. And in the right-hand diagram, what you see is that community and economy, and in that reading or representation, we can think of community as the social, that these are subsets of the environmental system. And so these are not systems of equal size that you need to bring into balance, but this is about the environmental system being, if you will, the holding system that enables the possibility of the social and the economic system. So it's a profoundly different perspective. And what this means is that there's a clear prioritization and sequencing about how to think about advancing sustainability and why it is that unsustainable practices, as in particular driven by economic relations and determinants, remains as powerful as it is, because, if you will, the influence and the power of the economy isn't scaled to its right weighting within that conception. Now, there's, of course, a whole set of pretty profound philosophical and social theoretical arguments that sit behind that. I'm not going to go into that this evening, but I just want to problematize the left-hand side reading and say that we are really working through the translation of this critique in mainstream policy thinking at the moment. So if we take the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, what is very different about this menu of areas of priority and importance would be Goals 5, Goals 10 in particular, the focus of inequality, and Goals 12 that focus specifically on responsible consumption and production. Now, why I say that this is different and novel is because when we contrast it to the Millennium Development Goals of 2000, they were really about maintaining growth, but making economic growth more pro-poor. And in fact, that was very much the discourse at the time, pro-poor growth. What this frame suggests is something rather different. There's an argument here that goals that deals with the biosphere are foundational in the way that we saw that earlier definitional idea that is different to the Brundtland conception, that it holds and society nests within that, and the economy nests within that, and our institutional formations that has got to give expression to the necessary partnerships to implement the agreements to achieve these goals is, if you will, the highest order or the most nested aspect of this particular conception. Now, of course, this is contested. You can still take the SDGs and represent them as a Venn diagram and discuss them as if there's this necessary balance. And I would argue that if you review a lot of the national development strategies or macroeconomic policies of most countries in the global south, it very much does that still. The point that I'm trying to make is that there's been substantive and meaningful policy advancement in thinking, and that it is possible within the existing mainstream frame to make this argument that this is how we should be thinking about the sequencing and the interrelationship between the 17 goals. Now, what this has enabled, I would argue, is a much more nuanced discussion than what we had in the wake of the Millennium Development Goals of 2000s. Because now we are explicitly exploring the limits of extractive capitalism, that this is no longer accepted as a viable framework for thinking about economic inclusion and well-being and livelihoods, but that we rather now have a discourse that comes from this framework around donut economics, where we explore what might be a safe and just space for humanity. And in this framework, the social foundation, again, is nested within the broader ecological system. And if you will, at the center of that is where you achieve economic outcomes. And it is in the articulation of these two things that we can begin to appreciate the need to fundamentally transition extractive capitalism to an economic system that is regenerative and more distributive. And some of the code words for this idea of a regenerative economy, of course, and a distributive economy would be concepts around circular economy, the care economy, the solidarity economy, and so forth. And none of these ideas are fixed. They're highly contested, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this shift that has happened. And it's important to locate how we think about sustainable cities within this shift over the last 15 or 20 years. So with that in mind, what I want to do now is to kind of draw your attention to some of the specificities of urbanization in Africa and kind of use it as a little bit of a reality check. So if we go back to that lofty suite of 17 SDGs, how do we advance those given the context that I will set out for you now? That's the question. So the first point to make, of course, is that Africa and Asia are the last two regions of the world that is still to achieve the 50% threshold in terms of population that live in urban areas. And it's the only two regions that still will see a dramatic expansion in population. So what we know is that between now and 2050, 90% of all urban growth in the world will derive from Asia and from Africa. Within that, Africa's got a significantly higher rate of urbanization because it is starting much later than Asia. Now, that trajectory, according to UN data, tells us that this robust demographic transition in Africa, which implies an increase in both urban and rural populations, this is really important, not just urban. What that means is that Africa's share of the global population will go from about 20% today to almost 40% by the end of the century. Of course, these are projections, but this is kind of best case scenarios based on different trajectories that the UN Statistical Agency has mapped out. Now, this should be really good news for Africa because we know historically from what has happened in Europe, in North America, in Japan, in Latin America, that we've never seen a growth in average incomes without urbanization. So there is a clear relationship between the degree of urbanization and the possibility of moving from low income to lower middle income to upper middle income. So what you see in this graph is that all these red dots are African countries. And as you can see, they are clustered in the groups of low income and lower middle income. And Asia is represented, this is obviously India, this big bubble, and this is obviously China because the size is proportional. So, of course, this is where we see the OECD countries in the main, and Latin America sits here mainly in upper middle income with a few outliers in lower middle income as well. Now, this is, if you will, what this suggests for Africa is that urbanization with a very youthful population, which means the labor market will treble in the next 30 years as Africa urbanizes, that this should be amazing news for most of Africa. The problem is that it's not, because we're not just looking at urbanization. There's a whole set of very unique and specific mega trends that are intersecting in a very unusual way in the African region. We're seeing, of course, this bifurcation in the world where the global north has got an aging population, and particularly Africa and Asia has got a youthful population, and especially Africa. We're also seeing a dramatic shift of global economic power away from North America and Europe towards Asia. And this has profound implications for the structure of the global economy, and particularly for the structure of global value chains and how African economies could potentially insert themselves into that. That, of course, relates very directly with profound technological change, which has huge implications for the future of work, no least because of digitization. And, of course, the big driver, as we already see, is the dramatic impact of climate change combined with resource depletion. And what resource depletion refers to is that the materials required for the metabolic system of the current global economy will simply not be available anymore over the next 20 to 30 years because of the rate of extraction up until now, with a great acceleration during the 20th century. So Africa and Asia simply doesn't have the same industrial model available to it to absorb labor and to grow its economies in the classic way. So what that basically means is that those correlations we saw before is kind of no longer applicable in the same way, or we can't expect them to. And I'll show you some of the data trends to show you that. So what is important to understand in all of this is the specificity of this form of urbanism that is playing out in the African context as it's urbanizing and as the labor force is trebling from close to 500 million today to about 1.4 billion by 2050, so in just under 30 years. So what we see at the moment is that in most African cities, there's a dramatic underinvestment in core urban infrastructure. What's the effect? you've got vast swathes of the urban population living in slums without access to basic services. Of course, this has a dramatic impact on social development outcomes. So we see enormous pressure on public health, very poor educational outcomes. And as a result, you don't see any generational social mobility. So in other words, the children of parents who were poor do not necessarily transition to the middle class as we've seen in other world regions during their transitions. And of course, what then happens is that human capital is stunted and most folk are trapped in low-wage informal work. And that means that household incomes are also very low. So due to low household income, again, you underinvest in education and in health because you simply don't have the resources. So what this means is that in most of these cities, you've got these informal hybrid service delivery systems. So about 20 to 30% of the city has access to grid infrastructure and modern infrastructure, if you will, but the rest of the city has got informal systems of accessing basic services, and that often feeds off or hacks the formal system to one degree or another. The outcome of that is that as these cities are growing, and as the population, and a lot of, by the way, of the urban pressure is not just rural to urban migration. In fact, outside of the low-income countries in Africa, so in other words, lower middle income and upper middle income countries, all of them, population growth within existing cities and towns account for most of the urban growth and not rural to urban migration. So it's a complicated story. Point is, demand continues to outstrip supply. What happens, you've got fierce competition for very scarce resources and to control those resources, both on the formal and on the informal side. And of course, inevitably, it means social cohesion in those societies are eroded and undermined. And you get a very particular kind of clientelistic politics that emerges, where people know that the only way in which they can influence the system is to act as a vote bank. Again, complicated story for another day, but just to say that you're not talking about conventional rules of the game as modern democratic theory would assume. You've got a much more variegated and murky system in terms of how people exercise power, how they exercise influence, and also how people's access to resources are mediated and controlled. Now, keeping those dynamics in mind, there's a broader structural factor at play. So what we've seen in the post-colonial period in Africa is that if you look at the slide on the left, this blue line shows you what has happened with manufacturing. So what this tells you is that from day one, there has been a declining capacity for industrial jobs across Africa. Now think of that, right? Africa's population has increased fourfold since that moment. And over that period of time, you've had urbanization start to take off in the mid-80s, and you've had a decline in manufacturing. So what that means is that is this red line, this orange line on this graph here. So this is what the ILO calls vulnerable employment, another word for informal employment. And basically 70% of all employment is vulnerable. And even with, so that's in 2000, and we've seen very significant growth in GDP numbers up until the financial crisis in 2008, and then again a significant uptick from 2010 onwards. And despite all of that growth, what we see is that that share of the labor force being precarious remains almost constant. So what we have is a form of jobless growth. Okay, it's not quite that, because what we're actually seeing is a growth of precarious employment. So that's a clumsy term, but you kind of get the basic idea. So the point of all of this is that Africa is facing a very unique situation where there are no formal economic opportunities for a growing and a youthful labor force within its cities and towns. And this is just a diagram that explains why that's the case. I won't go into the detail. Now, to flip this to the capital side and the investment side, what this global distribution of the 29 mega regions of the world demonstrates. So these 29 mega regions of the world, as you can see, clustered in that southeast part of China, in different European networks, and then, of course, in North America. And Sao Paulo is the one global node that features within this. That what is significant about this is that outside of Cairo and Tel Aviv as a cluster, there is no footprint for Africa within this global system as yet. Now, this demonstrates the degree to which it sort of demonstrates the investment side of that labor market problem that I've just explained to you. So essentially, from a global economic flows point of view, and I know Saskia has spoken to you about global cities, you can see that Africa is pretty much not yet on the map, so to speak. Now, what sits behind this picture is the fact that Africa as a whole contributes only 3.8% of global GDP, even though it's almost 20% of the global population, and accounts for only 2.8% of all global trade. Okay, so that's a position of structural marginality. So what happens is that elites in Africa, they then feel our responsibility, our challenge, and with elites, I mean sort of political elites in particular, that tends to overlap quite tightly with economic elites, that what we need as an absolute priority is to modernize at all costs and as quickly as possible. And what this has practically meant for most sub-Saharan African countries is to mimic a Western-centric approach. And the assumption is that if we can adopt some of the new platform technologies, we can leapfrog and save time, right? So renewable energy, for example, would be a good case of that. And of course, most importantly in the African context, it's ICT infrastructure. So this is the imaginary that structures how decision makers see the urban opportunity in the African continent. What does that mean in practice? It translates into these kinds of imaginaries. So what this shows you is it started off as a public housing response in Kilamba and Luanda. But very quickly they realized actually it was completely unaffordable for anyone who is low or middle income in Angolan society. And they had to completely rework the finances of it. But as you can see, this is an urban form and a typology that is very reminiscent of Chinese urbanism. And of course, the contractors and the financiers of this particular development was in fact Chinese. On the right-hand side is an intervention for a smart green city off Lagos on an island, and it's called Eco Atlantic. And this is the architectural render. If we had more time, I will show you what has actually happened, which is a completely different story. But the point is that these kinds of obsessions, whether it's these two or Konzo City in Nairobi or any number of others across the continent, they suck up all of the energy and attention of decision makers to achieve the ideal of modernization as quickly as possible. So the problem statement then is, in terms of the contemporary urban development model in Africa, is as follows. There's really three characteristics. One is that almost all investment tends to cater for the top 20% of the urban population with middle-class incomes, and it tries to respond to their residential and mobility needs. So think shopping mall, airport, ring roads, highways, and in a few cases, like in others, a light rail system to connect up these spaces. And of course, what comes with that is a real estate proposition of gated estates, particularly for the middle class. Now, often those are financed off the sort of off book for the public sector, but in most cases, the connective infrastructure that's required means that very limited public resources for infrastructure investment gets oriented towards these developments, and therefore they skew what gets invested in and what doesn't. But a more insidious problem is that even though the state is unable to provide basic services and economic infrastructure for the majority of urban populations, they also set up a regulatory frame whereby informal livelihoods gets criminalized. And it opens up informal workers to all kinds of extortion by various middlemen and petty bureaucrats. And the lack of adequate basic services, the absence of public housing programs of scale, the insufficient investment in public infrastructure and social development means that this unique opportunity that Africa has is having this growing labor market, labor force, is basically not being capitalized upon because none of those people are getting the necessary education or accessing economic opportunities to really give full expression to that latent productivity. So this is the vicious circle. I mean, this is obviously highly stylized, and I'm being very crude here, but to summarize a set of very complex and heterogeneous trends across the continent, I would argue that these are the fundamental problems that make it very, very difficult to take some of the things that I will explore next in terms of the policy ideas about what sustainable infrastructure might mean. It makes it very difficult to implement those. In other words, we need some kind of political economy understanding of the political opportunity space to advance sustainable city policy agendas. And yeah, I won't get into this, just to say that, you know, most people in Africa are extremely poor. So as you can see, 80% of the distribution live on below $2, $4 per day, as you can see. So if we are going to try and make sense of whether the policy ideas that arise from this discourse on sustainable cities has resonance in the African context, it has to, in my view, respond to these challenges. One is, of course, and very problematic, nutritional levels. Secondly, the absence of decent work and stable employment. The sort of, as I've already spoken about, work, and then, of course, this elite-based urban development model that dominates, and then this enormous gap between these grand policy agendas, whether it's sustainable development goals, the Pan-African agendas called Agenda 2063, the New Urban Agenda from Habitat 3 and so forth. There's a huge gap. So most African governments have signed up to all of these things, right? But them signing up to them and what they do on a day-to-day basis to give effect to urban governance and urban policy through their routine actions are two completely divergent things. Now, interestingly enough, and I'm using this to pivot to what are some of the dimensions of the sustainable cities approach, and just building a connection with sort of shifts in, if you will, political and policy openness. So this is a report by UNECA, which is the United Economic Commission for Africa. And they published this in 2017 with the theme urbanization and industrialization. And in this report, they go right to the heart of this problem of premature deindustrialization that I set out earlier, why it is that we've got this disproportionate share of the labor market trapped in vulnerable employment. And they argued that without an explicit and aggressive urban agenda, Africa won't be able to optimize the possibilities for structural transformation to achieve industrialization. And they argue African cities, and I just want to reflect this because I want to give you a sense of, in a way, how the public policy debates have become quite blunt and explicit about the importance of dealing more aggressively, if you will, with the urban question. They argue that African cities face low productivity, tepid job creation, high informality, huge infrastructure and service gaps, weak linkages with rural areas, high levels of informality, increasing inequalities, growing environmental damage, and vulnerability to climate change, and weak institutional systems and capacities. Unless resolved, these impediments will undermine Africa's urban potential for structural transformation. So, you know, that's more blunt than what I've been. And this is sort of an official UN body that in particular engages with ministers of finance on the African continent. Now, keeping that in mind, I want to shift now and really suggest that if we read the SDGs through that frame of embedded systems of thinking about sustainable development, we can think in really expansive terms about what sustainable cities involves in terms of a set of policy actions that needs to be taken. So in my view, the fundamental difference with the SDGs to what has come before is that it accepts the environmental critique that the current form of the global economy, what I called earlier extractive capitalism, is fundamentally unviable. And therefore, we need a fundamentally different consumption and production system. And of course, because of the nature of the SDGs, it doesn't say explicitly this implies a cultural change, but of course that's what we're talking about, is a deep and profound societal cultural change to change the structure of desire which drives consumption, of course. Now, you can't change the nature of consumption and production without substituting existing products and services with sustainable or regenerative or renewable ones. And therefore, you need innovation and you need new kinds of infrastructures. And I will argue later on that those infrastructures operate on different scalar or spatial determinants. And I'll come back to that. I'm just parking that point for now. But the beauty of this point is that it means that even though we cannot replicate the modernization model of the global north and parts of the global south of the 20th century, we can think of a completely different model of industrialization and labor creation that responds to these new products and services. And a way of grounding that, or a place to start, is the reimagination and the rebuilding of our cities and communities. So goal 11. So that for me is really, we can frame that as the driver of this massive, massive systemic civilizational transformation that we're talking about. Of course, an important informant of what we mean by sustainable cities and communities has to be the cluster of environmental and ecological goals, 13, 14, and 15. And that has got to drive, or how we define what we mean by decent work and economic growth, right? So the proposition here, or the thesis that I'm putting forward, is that for us to understand how to unpack this idea of sustainable cities, we need to appreciate the potential of really placing sustainable cities and communities at the center of this ambitious transformational project that is implicit in the SDGs, but never spoken that explicitly. So the reason why I've kind of done this flow diagram is because when you see the 17 SDGs as a flat plane, as I showed you in the earlier slide, you miss the dynamics involved in, if you will, in disrupting and unseating the power relations that keep that flat plane in place, because that flat plane means you're kind of trying to do everything at the same time and you're trying to balance all of those things out. No, we can't do that. It won't work. We have to have a focus, and that focus has got to think through what the outcomes are that we want to achieve. And for me, the sustainable growth or regenerative growth, whatever you want to call it, and the cluster of goals that relates to the environmental parameters, those are the outcomes. How do we get there? We live differently and we build differently. And I would argue that when we look at those impact goals, when we look at the material empowerment that sits in that first set of goals that deals with livelihood and well-being, those are impacts that we'll achieve if we are able to get to those outcomes. Now, of course, what you often see is that people use those as an entry point. And I would argue that that would keep you mired in a reformist agenda. And of course, material empowerment and political empowerment, they have an interface. So this is the frame that I would suggest is the conceptual starting point for thinking through what the dimensions of sustainable cities might be. And so the next slide is really the crux of the talk for tonight. And that is that the one dimension of this clearly is this idea of sustainable infrastructure. And I'll say a little bit more about that and what that means in the African context. And the other two readings that I gave you to kind of prepare for tonight really elaborates on what that refers to, what that means. What is modern infrastructure that we need to transition away from, and what is sustainable infrastructure? Of course, the way we build and how we retrofit the existing built stock is a massive agenda. So just that component represents 40% of the carbon envelope we have to achieve the 1.5 degree target for 2050 in terms of the IPCC framework. Now, none of those two things are possible unless you fundamentally change planning, zoning, and regulatory reform. Of course, colleagues from Brazil will have a lot of experience on the back of the Statute of the City and various other experimentations in Brazil over the last 30 years with alternatives, inclusionary zoning, with what that might entail. But we need to go much further. And that work, in my view, is a little bit stifled by the fact that we are confronted by a more profound philosophical crisis. So if we look at the sort of work on ecosystem services and what that refers to, and we look at the importance of building an alternative paradigm of land and property, these two thought systems haven't yet connected. We haven't yet built a synthesized philosophical framework to think those things together. And I would argue that that is a precondition to really get the alternative planning, zoning, and regulatory reform stuff right. That doesn't mean you've got to wait for that before we do this. We can experiment, but just to signal that there's also much deeper conceptual, theoretical work that's required. None of these things happen because people think, or they get persuaded by the policy argument. They only really translate into a form of practice if they are embedded in a coalition-based politics. And of course, what we've seen is that the climate movement in particular, particularly the climate justice movement, has been most animated, if you will, to achieve a new kinds of politics that spans different scales, that is able to capture the imagination and so on. But much more is required. And then I'm busy trying to make sense of just how significant are these new digital infrastructures to enable both new imaginaries, new practices, and also enable different scalar dynamics of these frameworks. So the sustainable infrastructure, to kind of concretize that, and here I'm thinking of all of the sectors, whether it be energy, waste, water, mobility, public space, health infrastructure, and so on. When we think of the investments into these things, that's the political opportunity to change really the sort of the part that attracts the most capital in how our cities are built. So why not, from a systems perspective and thinking through that urban context of informality that I mentioned earlier, think very precisely about what kind of infrastructure do we need? And this is the criteria that we've developed through our research. So the first criteria is, of course, low carbon. And I'll give you an example just now of kind of what form that might take. And of course, the emergent debates in the last 6 to 8 years around the circular economy and various versions of it is a good example of this. Labor intensive and generative, this has to be absolutely fundamental requirement just because of the reasons I've mentioned about this massive, massive labor force and the prevalence of vulnerable employment. This idea that we've got to understand how to optimize the circulation of value at the lowest possible level and to retain value within communities in particular. Digitally enabled and primed, and lastly, relating to the land question, spatially efficient and just. In other words, how does it advance the diversity of land uses, equitable access, and cultural dynamism? So, of course, this is ambitious, but the point is that unless we can use those scarce resource investments into the next generation of infrastructure unless it does all of these things, it is probably not going to be appropriate. And this is concretely what I mean in the context of an African urban reality with sustainable cities. It is this kind of investment. Now, there's sort of a whole set of issues here on governance implications. I won't go into too much detail here, just to say that we've seen on the back of the SDGs, the IPCC Paris Climate Agreement, the new urban agenda from 2016 and so on, a crystallization of what the macro governance framework should be. There's sort of an acceptance you need a national development strategy. Your economic strategy should align with it and not drive it, as has been the case during the heyday of neoliberalism. You need some kind of national spatial perspective. You need explicit urban and rural policies that are linked, and you need a national infrastructure investment program. And of course, with all of the Build Back Better discourse of the last while, in the post-COVID period, et cetera, this, of course, has become extremely sexy. There's two then frames or lenses to think through alignment and sequencing. The one is nationally determined contributions. This is where national governments say how they're going to achieve their decarbonization goals to achieve the net zero economy by 2050, and national urban policies is how this is going to happen aligned with this broader framework. Now, of course, the role of cities and how they feed into this is a whole nother discussion. The importance of strategic data management is the underpinning of this, but just to kind of paint this picture. Now, one way in which this finds practical expression is from the Paris Agreement. There was this report produced to specifically look at what is the role of cities to achieve the 1.5 degree target. And in this particular report, they argue that the most powerful levers are energy, land and ecosystems, urban and infrastructure and industry. So you can see how it ties back to the frame that I presented earlier around that hierarchy of sustainable city interventions. They then offer this template in this report, which I'm not going to go through, don't worry, but just to show you kind of how they've unpacked all of the component elements, the energy system, the infrastructure system, the industrial system, and what both the adaptation and the mitigation options are, what is the local context, how to adapt for that, et cetera, et cetera. So the point that I'm trying to make with this is that there's sort of all this stuff about how do you do this in a practical policy terms, but they all assume that this can be a state-driven agenda. And this is just not possible in the African context because of the very unique political and institutional failures we've had over a long period of time. And this manifests specifically in very limited democratic decentralization and almost no tax base at the local level. There's a profound disconnect between macroeconomic policy and urban development, and the regulatory power of the state in most cities is extremely limited because it tries to use a rules-driven model, and actually the context requires for a much more adaptive, responsive model. That's sort of just a fancy way of saying the regulatory system is profoundly bureaucratic in a context where things get done by, if you will, hustling the system. So I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'm just going to sort of maybe turn to just flag the slide that, these are all, this work is all, these are a set of propositions. It's not, if you will, resolved theoretical or conceptual frames. They're propositions, and they kind of really need to be refined through a set of empirical explorations and through concept building. Some of the key concepts, I think, is really at the heart of this, is what we mean by hybrid infrastructures. And we unpack that a little bit in a very provisional way in the second reading that you've got. Ideas of localization and circularity, regionalism, interoperability of different systems, formal and informal, and of course the role of digital platforms to enable interoperability. And then lastly, the absolute essential nature of open systems of experimentation and learning. It's the only way we're going to scale. So this is the point that I want to then conclude on, and then I'll just show you the two examples very briefly, and we can break for discussion. So for me, when people think of the institutional aspects of this, and I remember from conversations I had with colleagues in Brazil, looking at specifically the fragmentation of governance in Sao Paulo a long time ago, there the holy grail is metropolitan governance of the whole of the Sao Paulo region. But actually, what we now know is that if we want to manage, for example, water catchments, the administrative authorities and the actual ecological catchment region, that these geographies are completely asynchronous. And it's important to kind of think about this regional scale, or what some are calling a bioregional scale. At the same time, if we look at using infrastructure investment to build neighborhoods and livelihoods and suck up employment, then highly localized forms of service delivery through, for example, microgrids and so forth, becomes a set of explorations. And again, we still have a long way to go to really theoretically work this through. But I do know that both of those scales need to be much sharper in our understanding to figure out what these hybrid pathways are going to be to sustainable cities. So let me skip this and then just end up with these two examples. So this example is from Cape Town. So this is where a group of scientists and architects and so on work together. And the problem is this tree. So most of the fauna in the country, but let's stick with Cape Town for now, are what we call alien species, right? So they're not indigenous. And in fact, what they do is that they consume up to 100 to 200 times more water per day compared to indigenous fauna. And so we've got a massive challenge to clear out these alien forests. And the question is, can one repurpose that as a raw material for a sustainable construction material? So this is a slurry that's produced by wood chipping the trees and having a 5% cement component, and it produces this. What they've then done is that they've experimented with using the public housing subsidy amount in South Africa to say, if we use non-mechanical construction processes like there, we use unskilled, unemployed folk, and we embed this within community-based planning and co-design processes, can we completely re-engineer the public housing program in South Africa to produce larger and more effective housing, but at the same time construct local economies and create a sense of pride because you embed these houses within a larger open space system within these communities. And so this particular experiment has gotten all of the national standards approvals, and this material outperforms conventional brick and mortar by a significant margin in terms of insulation, in terms of tensile strength, and so forth and so forth. So that's one example. You can ask me in discussion time what's happened with this and why we're not able to mainstream this. But this is a good example of what I'm talking about. The second project is in Kibera in Nairobi in Kenya. And this is called the Public Space Project. And this is led by an NGO called KDI in conjunction with a number of local partners. And essentially what they've done is to build out this methodology where they have typologies of green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, and what they call gray infrastructure. And they try and understand how to reclaim potential public space areas that have become impossible to navigate because of pollution and waste. And so if you look at this site here, that is this area here, it's on the edge of the Nairobi Dam that abuts Kibera, which is the settlement here. And that's what it looked like. And so by using this typology and working with the local organizations in this area, they were able to reclaim that land and build this. And this intervention has all of these components, right? A community center, playground, vegetable farm, blah, 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 blah. And this particular project took 4 years to complete. And it was completely driven by the local community, and maintenance is done by the local community. They've been able to, over the last 15 years, do this kind of acupunctural intervention across the entire slum. And every time working with the local community, they're able to figure out what is the calibration of green, blue, and gray infrastructures you need to respond to the specificity of that context. Long story, complicated story, but just to demonstrate what I mean by radical localization in the context of this framework. So finally then, and to kind of take us back to, I guess, the objectives of the course, the larger landscape of urban studies, and thinking about this question of sustainable cities. For me, we need a conceptual approach that sits at the intersection of critical urban studies, systems thinking, design thinking, and really engaging with technological intermediation and the function it can perform. Understand that any intervention has got to be profoundly participatory, as we've seen through the Kibere example, and that you need collective mobilization of one form or another to hold the intervention institutionally and to do the political intermediation with a formal governance system. Now, this hasn't yet, if you will, become a starting point for thinking about research and practice around sustainable cities, but this is kind of, I guess, what my intellectual project is all about. So I hope that whistle-stop tour was helpful, and it also made some of the readings a little bit clearer. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so, wow, where to start? I mean, it was a complete and total package, right? So the first part is, of course, that urban planning in African cities was, and then the form of our cities was a direct consequence of colonial urban planning. So the colonial city was designed to have an enclave for the colonial administrative elite, and that then would later on become the core of the formal city, or the CBD, and where the new elite would settle. And as a result of that, we had kind of American-style sprawl built into the DNA of our cities from the beginning, because the only form of settlement that was regarded as appropriate for non-colonial population or indigenous populations was this form of township development that had this very bizarre modernist form where you had a dwelling on a plot in the middle of nowhere, as far away as possible from the colonial core and as close as possible to the economic structures. And then what we see is that, of course, in the post-colonial era, the administrators who administer these areas and the bylaws that underpin them, they don't get reformed. And in fact, in most, we did a survey, I think it was in 2008 or 2009, of planning laws across the continent. And in the majority of cases, they were still by and large consistent with colonial era planning regulations and guidelines. So that's sort of the one aspect of it. So it just means that in the post-colonial era, this distortion structures private capital investment and public investment, and it just exacerbates it. And South Africa is a very extreme case where that has even happened in the democratic era after 94. So that's the one part of it. The second part of it, I think, which is the more insidious part, and that is the imaginary of what makes a good city or a modern city. And I think that those norms remain deeply, deeply entrenched with both elites and ordinary folk, right? So when you, for example, in South Africa, want to have conversations in poor neighborhoods, people are deeply resistant to the idea of medium density living, because for them that means that you are asking them to settle for a standard that is less than the suburban ideal. And how dare you, right? So it creates incredibly difficult political problems because of the cultural norms that sit in the fabric of the society. And I guess the last point to make is that the professional groups, the planners, the architects, the engineers, all of those associations, when you look at their disciplinary training and their professional training and what constitutes professional norms to be certified as an engineer or to be certified as a planner or whatever the case might be, it remains absolutely consistent with the norms from the colonial era, right? So it's at so many different levels, and it's become invisible because it is just the normal in our cities today. Yeah, that's a great question. So the big players in Africa that deals with urban development is the Germans, GIZ and BMZ. It's the Swedish, CEDA, the Swiss a little bit, AFD, the French Development Bank, and then of course, I don't know what they call these days, but what used to be known as DFID, the British Development Corporation and so on. So those are the big ones. They've all, I would argue, been very active in promoting exactly what you're asking, that national governments create an enabling environment for municipal government to grow and to flourish, that they implement democratic devolution, that they reform the financial systems, that they take participatory governance more seriously, etc., etc., etc. So what we've seen is a really significant and stubborn resistance on the part of most national governments to really follow through. So all of them say, yes, cool, we agree, participatory governance is important, blah, blah, blah. But when you look at the legislative reform agenda to actually devolve powers to regional and city governments, there was a wave between 1990 and 95, 96, and then it plateaus. And then we've seen in the last 10 years a reversal where certain powers were brought back up to national government, for example, in Kenya and in a few other geographies. And what has happened here is that what is important part of this to understand is that multi-party democratic system is very recent in most African countries. We're talking mid-1980s, mid-1990s onwards. And in African countries, the dominant political parties used to be the independence or the freedom movements from the pre-colonial era or the colonial era. And so what we've seen is the emergence of opposition political parties in the context of multi-party democracy being introduced and them getting a foothold in the cities. And so what has happened is that in terms of the political economy of political power, there's been a resistance to devolve, or there's been a reluctance to devolve more powers and more resources to city governments, because that is precisely where their political opponents are the strongest. And so, and that you can only really make sense of if you appreciate that we're very new to multi-party democracy in most parts of the continent. It's very, very recent. So that's the one dynamic at play. The other dynamic is that the way in which infrastructure investment is channeled, it is through utility companies. And these utility companies are controlled by national ministers. And the utility companies already struggle to balance their books and to have a viable balance sheet for them to attract finance, investment. So their argument is, if you are going to ask us to share power with the city governments in terms of planning, in terms of maintenance of infrastructure, there's no way our balance sheet will be strong enough to attract loan finance. So they resisted as well. So you've got both the political incentive to not devolve, and you've got kind of an institutional financial incentive to also not devolve powers to city governments. So to answer your question, Letitia, most of the donor countries push very hard for this, but they also have very little impact for the reasons that I've just mentioned. Yeah, it's a great question. So different policy frameworks have kind of different roles. So something like Agenda 2063 is very interesting because so one of the challenges that Africa faces, just from sort of, if you think of the continent as a whole in terms of its marginality in the global economy, is the fact that it is completely divided. So every country negotiates bilateral trade agreements with China or Turkey or Indonesia or whatever the case might be. There isn't the regional associations like the Southern African Development Corporation or ECOWAS or whatever. They've never really been able to influence national government economic policy or trade policy. So one of the things that became crystal clear when Agenda 2063 was being developed was that because Africa's intra-Africa trade was less than 10%, so in terms of the total volume of trade that all African countries exercise, less than 10% was with other African countries. So you can imagine how crazy that is, right? And so a big part of Agenda 2063 is simply to create, if you will, almost a political movement that encourages a common African market. So it's kind of, that's really its main thing. It's to say, let's have a timetable that we're going to phase in a common economic market within 20 years with clear milestones to get there. But of course, that's super difficult because every country has these existing agreements. So if South Africa has an agreement with, let's say, Italy, or let's take France. So we also produce champagne, or let's take Portugal. We also produce port, but we can't call it port because, you know, in terms of the trade agreement with Portugal, we've said to be able to trade other goods and services, we're not going to use the label port because we don't want to mess with your brand, even though, you know, port isn't a specific whatever. Anyway, the point is that countries will have to untangle those agreements if they're in a common market. And that takes time, and that's super complicated. So what Agenda 2063 did or does is two things. One is that for the first time in global discussions and global negotiations, African presidents can stand up and say, we as Africans have a vision. We might be the stepchildren of the global system, but, you know, we've got an agenda, we've got a vision, we've come together, and Agenda 2063 says X, Y, and Z. Amazing, right? But the engine of that is to get to a common African market, because the assumption is that if you can raise the level of intra-Africa trade from 15% to 40%, it will strengthen all of the economies, and it will strengthen Africa's bargaining power in the global economy. And then the global, so for example, just to give you one example, I mean, this stuff is so crazy. When the last round of trade negotiations happened for the World Trade Organization in terms of the global trading system, everyone in that negotiation agreed that Africa will be the only world region that will experience a net loss as a result of the rules by about 15%. But because Africa has got zero bargaining power in those negotiations, it was agreed, right? It's that crazy. So unless Africa is able to basically strengthen its bargaining power in the global system, it's kind of completely and utterly, it's going to remain marginal. So that's the only thing Agenda 2063 is actually trying to do is to push that. And they kind of have made quite good progress because the common market came into being from the 1st of January last year, because more than 26 countries ratified the agreement. So that's like a huge, huge step for us. Now, the next step is a common passport and a common skies policy so that our airlines don't pay taxes in each other's airports and so on. It's more expensive for me to go to Luanda or to go to Nairobi than it is to go to Paris or Amsterdam or London in terms of airfares. I mean, it's completely nuts. So that's that. So the reason I mention that is because it's a complement to national policies and to local policies. So if you, for example, Congo, and your main comparative advantage is your mineral resources that is essential for all of the new clean tech, whether it's catalytic converters for electric vehicles or it is whatever for the cell phones and so on, you know, you are still going to negotiate as a country the terms of trade in terms of the companies that's going to buy the products or the countries that will buy that from you. But now you've got a broader agenda to make sure that you also export to other countries that could manufacture in Africa, such as Morocco or South Africa or Egypt, right? And that's the big difference, is that it will be a very profound complement to how people have traditionally have done these bilateral trade negotiations. The last point to make is that, I mean, I don't want to create the image that Agenda 2063 is this amazing thing and it solves all the problems. It's not by any means of the imagination. It basically, in its implementation, which we're tracking in ACC, we're trying to understand what exactly is the investments coming. There's three things that's emerging. One is these transnational corridors, like mobility, like rail corridors from Mombasa through Rwanda all the way to DRC, or a corridor across West Africa and so on. All great, necessary, important. Secondly, industrial processing zones or export processing zones is the second thing they invest in. And this typically is linked to the port investments that gets made, again, typically by Chinese investment banks. And that's, of course, to get extractives to those markets as quickly as possible. And the third thing is, interestingly enough, is these new towns that I critiqued in my presentation. So when you look at the spatial footprint of where these infrastructure investments are going, they are in net terms worsening the urban challenges that I've explained earlier, because they are not being calibrated to local development frameworks and plans of these cities and towns. And so there's a profound disconnect. So long story short, it's a really important step forward in a context of huge institutional deficit that we have Agenda 2063. It fulfills a very important function to orient trade policies. It also is a very important mechanism to aggregate capital, because a lot of global investors want these big programs because otherwise they feel the risk is too high. But we are overdue to make sure that cities and regions are engaging with that investment agenda so that it doesn't undermine integrated development possibilities at the local level. So that's kind of where we are at. So hopefully that helps you to appreciate that there's still a lot of room to calibrate local plans, but you know, this doesn't displace that. It potentially complements that. So that's a good question. I mean, so a lot of my work is to interact with, so I'll use an example that that will make sense for you. So when was it? Anyway, about 5, 6, 7 years ago, I want to say. I've got an absolutely useless memory. I've got no short, medium, or long-term memory. It's like, so it's hard for me to make sense of time. But so there was this international attempt to create a social science version of the International Panel on Climate Change to kind of look at the big social questions. So it was called, I'm looking for the book. Anyway, there was a chapter on cities, and Saskia and I were the two co-chairs of that chapter. And we then had a network of 12 scholars from around the world working with us to write that chapter. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that, this was sort of, obviously I brought my research and what I work on into that conversation, which looked at the global north and the south and blah, blah, blah. And so there's a very interesting discussion going on, because if you remember the kind of highlights of the thesis I put forward to you in the talk about the specificity of African urbanization, so there's two things going on. One is there is an informalization of labor markets everywhere. It's not just in Africa. We start with informal and we're informalizing, so it is acute in Africa, but it's not unique. So the discourse in the north tends to be around precarious employment, right? So you would have heard that, and all of you are sweating bullets because you're all born into precarity. There's no lifelong employment for you anywhere, no fixed pension, no proper medical care. You are all screwed. So that's just like your generational problem. So that phenomena, because it is really setting in the global north because of the deep systemic crisis of the welfare state in its various forms, whether it's the Brazilian form or the European form, means that people are appreciating that there's a profound changing nature of work and of society as a whole. And in some ways, Africa has kind of lived that already, right? That's kind of that's always been the condition. So there's some people who's trying to appreciate how can we learn from the African experience, and there's a very rich body of theory and social theory and thinking about that condition, and that, sort of in other fields is having a significant impact. The second part of that is that, and this is going to maybe be surprising or not, but recent data suggests that Africa has by far, by a very significant margin, the largest proportion of its population that uses electronic financial services of any world region. So it is significantly higher than Europe and substantially higher than Asia, and also significantly higher than Latin America. So there's something about the youthful demographic and the immediacy with which digital platforms just synced up with these informal systems in Africa. And so Africa is in some ways a laboratory about that social translation of digital platforms and technologies. How does it get taken up in society? What's the meaning of it? What's the potentiality to rethink both financial transactions, but also other kinds of services and mobility systems and so on? So one example, the informal motorcycle taxis in Dar es Salaam, for example, they're called boda bodas. They self-organized, so that, they are absolutely crazy, right? So no one wears a helmet. The roads are completely potholed, and so you take your own life in your hands by getting on the back of one of those. And of course, they're not regulated. So they self-organized and got local programmers to produce an Uber-like app for them, which they've now used widely in the city. And as a result of that, they now all wear these vests. They're wearing helmets because there's a feedback mechanism through the app about the drivers, right? And so it has dramatically increased safety and the efficiency of the system, but all of that is self-organized, right? There's no government body that came to regulate or to stimulate a cluster or invest in a startup, or none of that happened. It just kind of exploded because the local actors in the system could see the benefit of a facility like that to improve productivity. And that, applies in many, many other sectors. So yeah, so in those senses, I think what makes the way in which African cities are self-organized to some extent and how that is being digitally enhanced, I think will be an important lesson that other world regions will draw on in the future. So Okay, let me, so I don't know enough about the EU Global Gateway project to answer your question directly in terms of recent updates. In terms of the general point about the China Belt Road Initiative and the EU approaches. So these things are they're very different in the sense that the geopolitical agendas of the two bodies are quite different. So in the case of China, the Belt Road Initiative is it looks very deliberate and intentional, but it's actually a very loose frame for a whole set of negotiations and investments that have already been pre-negotiated before they kind of put that map over all of these investments. So that's important to appreciate, because the Belt Road Initiative is stuttering somewhat because of the global financial crisis in the context of COVID, and the sort of the inability of a lot of sort of states that investments have been made into to meet their debt obligations. So China's kind of got to rethink that whole thing pretty much, because the world is a very different place in terms of liquidity and the capacity to service debt. So that's one story. The EU project is more interesting and potentially more aligned with the Agenda 2063 objectives, but it suffers from an acute case of double standards. So when you look at the detail of the various preparatory processes for the next round of EU-Africa trade negotiations, which is meant to be concluded this year, because the new agreement has to start in 2024 up until 2030, the EU basically has gone in the opposite direction of what it says it wants to do. So so just give you one example. One of the biggest challenges that African countries will face is that if the carbon tax that EU member states will introduce in 2028 is applied at the border, it will basically cripple African exports into the EU for a very long time. There's just no way that African economies can mitigate the sources of their energy system by 2028. In other words, move away from coal to renewables, and it's an impossible time frame. Now, the EU has rendered that issue a non-negotiable topic. So they're not even willing to discuss a timetable for the carbon tax at the border to be deferred to a later date if there's an example of a transition pathway by an African member state. So what that means is that, so the EU talks Green New Deal, and that will apply in Africa. They talk all of that stuff, but the detail of the trade negotiations goes in the exact opposite direction. So both the Belt Road Initiative and the EU agenda is not in any way going to serve the African agenda at all. And because Africa's bargaining power is still relatively weak, it's going to remain, it's going to have to accept a far than satisfactory agreement with both of these two blocks. That's my read at the moment, but yeah. Yeah, so what I didn't have time to get into today is really an institutional perspective on this economic question, right? So obviously, in my view, given what I outlined about the jobs crisis, right? Like jobs and the economy is kind of got to be the beginning and the end of all of our conversations, right? So what I'm thinking through at the moment is, how do we take the broad categories and kind of stretch them a little bit to think somewhat differently? So if most of the labor force is trapped in vulnerable employment or informal, low-paying, precarious jobs, and there's a very small possibility of formal jobs, like what's that connecting tissue between these two things? So in my own mind, I think this idea of thinking of the social economy is a way to identify categories of economic organization, whether you're talking about non-profit companies, social benefit companies, startups that don't yet have the possibility of profitability, but is an important dimension of the economic story. All of that for me sits there, because the startups in Africa, what you will find is that almost all of them have a social impact purpose because of the deficits we face in terms of basic infrastructure. So they'll kind of try and come and solve the land use issue. They'll think of an app, they'll think of a financial service, they'll, all kinds of things. And often they've got a strong gender focus in terms of empowering women in particular, and so on. So within that broader frame, in thinking of the importance of social enterprises as a category of economic actor that potentially has a social impact, but operates on the basis of business productivity principles, so that you run a good business and you make modest profits as opposed to obscene profits. For me, that's the sort of the space we've got to be thinking through in terms of the economic strategy. So the startup sector has got a huge role to play in that regard, because one, it is extremely dynamic. And there is definitely, outside of South Africa in particular, which is a story for another day, but in most parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there's a very, very driven entrepreneurial culture. And that mirrors politically, where the current youthful generation have completely disconnected from the norms of political subservience, if you will, of their parents' generation. So you've seen lots of protests, but these are not sustained political mobilizations. They're just a disposition that they just don't have the same reverence for authority or political power as the previous generation. But that manifests in their economic life and so on, in my view. The problem we face is that, and I spoke with someone who runs a venture capital fund for these startups a couple of weeks ago, 2 months ago. And he was telling me they work across the continent, North Africa, all the way down. He was telling me that the mortality rate of the startups is about 85 to 90%. In other words, most of them just don't survive. They die within the first 12 months. So yes, we've got this dynamic environment, but the enabling and supporting environment for these startups is still profoundly problematic. And we haven't yet built that ecosystem. So I do see a very significant role for them, but I also see the need for really substantial thinking about how does one create a supportive and nurturing environment for this new form of economic actors. Yeah. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the questions and the engagement. Thank you.